When facing the queen's gambit declined, white often develops the light-squared bishop by playing e3 and then activating it from the e2 or d3 squares. A popular alternative to this classical plan is activating the light-squared bishop on the long light-squared diagonal by playing g3, turning the game into the positionally rich Catalan opening. Let's see how we reach the Catalan from the starting position. After the opening moves d4 and d5, both sides controlling a fair share of the center, white turns the game into the ambitious queen's gambit with c4, attacking black's central stronghold on d5. When black responds with the solid move e6, this turns the game into the queen's gambit declined, with the idea of meeting c takes d5 with e takes d5, maintaining a healthy pawn center. White's most direct plan is to add more pressure against black's center with knight c3, but if white is planning to play the Catalan, then we'll likely see the move knight f3. In the Catalan, the knight on b1 remains flexible, and although there are some cases where the knight moves to c3, there are many examples where the knight prefers to move to d2, and in certain cases the knight even develops from the a3 square. After black continues with the sensible developing move knight f6, white officially turns the game into the Catalan with g3. White's idea is to develop the light-squared bishop on the long diagonal, where it can exert long-term pressure against black's queenside. Since the light-squared bishop will no longer control the f1 to a6 diagonal, the c4 pawn may become sensitive to attack. Black now has an important decision to make. One path is to play d takes c4, turning the game into the open Catalan, or maintaining a pawn on d5 and continuing to develop, known as the closed Catalan. Let's first take a look at the closed Catalan with bishop e7. In the closed Catalan, black maintains a strong pawn center, so white will typically focus on preparing the e4 pawn break, challenging black's center and taking more space. White activates the Catalan bishop with bishop g2, when both sides typically castle. As is the case in most positions for black in the queen's gambit declined, the price to pay for this rock-solid setup based upon e6 is that the light-squared bishop is restricted. Black will usually solve this by playing b6, intending bishop b7, and in some cases, bishop a6. If black decides to play b6 immediately, this allows white to play a favorable c takes d5, opening up the c-file and adding long-term pressure against black's center. For this reason, it's more popular in the closed Catalan to first play c6, reinforcing the d5 pawn, preparing to respond to c takes d5 with c takes d5, maintaining a symmetrical structure when white has not achieved anything special out of the opening. A flexible and thematic developing move in the Catalan to keep in mind is queen c2, activating the queen on the b1 to h7 diagonal, pointing directly at the center, as well as black's kingside. The queen also supports the c4 pawn, as well as clearing the d1 square for white's rook, which is often useful to help support the center, as well as align with the enemy queen. At this point, black can play b6 immediately, or first develop the other knight with knight b to d7. At this point, you have no shortage of ideas to explore, including rook d1, bishop f4, as well as b3, which may prepare a queenside fianchetto, but it also protects c4, so white can play knight c3 without giving up protection of the c4 pawn. In addition to all of these interesting options, a straightforward continuation for white is knight b to d2, adding more support to the c4 pawn, and most importantly preparing the thematic e4 pawn break. A common continuation is b6. Preparing to develop the light-squared bishop, white does not hesitate to strike in the center and plays e4. When you play the closed variation of the Catalan as black, it's important to remain patient and try not to open up the position too quickly. The interested viewer is definitely encouraged to explore the position after bishop b7. Black reinforces the center, refusing to give up the central stronghold on d5. It is true that white can take space with e5, forcing black's knight to retreat, but black's position remains quite solid and is difficult to break down. Black is not forced to play passively for the rest of the game, especially as black can focus on chipping away at white's center with the timely c5 pawn break. That being said, it isn't so easy to embrace the tension with bishop b7, allowing white to grab space in the center, so a common choice is to resolve the tension with d takes e4. Knight takes e4. If black plays knight takes e4, this allows queen takes e4, centralizing the queen, where it adds pressure against both black's kingside as well as queenside. Instead of capturing the knight, black can focus on development with bishop b7. In the closed variation, a general plan of development for black is to play bishop b7, followed by rook c8, preparing a timely c5 pawn break. White can anticipate this possibility by playing rook d1, supporting the center as well as aligning with the enemy queen. In response to rook d1, it's a good idea for black to move the queen away from the d-file, and since queen c7 runs into bishop f4, queen c8 is a passive but solid choice, allowing black to prepare the eventual c5 pawn break without having to worry about exposing the queen on the d-file. Instead of following this patient approach, it may feel tempting to try and open up the position immediately with c5, attacking white's center and revealing the light-squared bishop's pressure against the knight on e4. White's gradual pressure can turn into dangerous attacking play if black tries to open the position up too early, as is the case here, starting with knight takes f6 check. This is a very unpleasant capture to meet, as the natural knight takes f6 allows white to win a pawn with d takes c5, discovering the rook's attack against the enemy queen. Capturing with g takes f6 would significantly compromise black's castled kingside, and if black plays bishop takes f6, a typical tactical signal in the Catalan is the loose bishop on b7 aligned with white's bishop on g2. We can combine this signal with white's queen pointing at h7, which is only protected by the king, thanks to removing the knight on f6. This allows white to play the instructive knight g5, threatening queen takes h7 checkmate, as well as exposing the light-squared bishop's attack against its counterpart on b7. After the forcing sequence bishop takes g5, bishop takes b7, white's Catalan bishop has come to life, dominating the light squares, as well as attacking the rook on a8. After rook b8, not only can white play the attractive bishop e4, creating a strong queen-bishop battery pointing directly at h7, white can also play the clever d takes c5, capturing a pawn and pinning the d7 knight to black's queen. Since the queen is protecting the knight on d7, bishop takes g5 would overwhelm the queen. So one possible attempt for black is to play rook takes b7, adding another defender to the knight on d7, but unfortunately this walks into a pawn fork with c6, forking the rook and knight. So after rook c7, white can play the instructive sequence rook takes d7, rook takes d7, when white can highlight black's overworked queen with bishop takes g5, queen takes g5, c takes d7. After the smoke clears, white is up a pawn, enjoying a dangerous advance past pawn on d7. White will complete development with rook d1, when black has a very unpleasant position to try and defend. Although these tactics may be specific to the position, it's a common theme that white can translate the early positional pressure out of the opening into long-lasting endgame grinds. Before we take a look at the open Catalan when black plays d takes c4 on the fourth move, it's important to note that from the closed Catalan move order, instead of continuing with c6, reinforcing the center, black can still open the position with d takes c4. This is considered a solid, reliable choice, so it's no coincidence this is a popular option for black at Grandmaster level. In response to d takes c4, white has several interesting choices to consider, including the relatively popular sideline knight e5, attacking the c4 pawn and opening up the light-squared bishop. White sometimes decides to develop the knight on b1 to c3, and even in some cases to a3, preparing to capture the c4 pawn, but also inviting black to play the interesting capture bishop takes a3, doubling and isolating white's pawns on the a-file, as well as challenging white to find a way to regain the pawn on c4. These are all interesting options to explore, but the absolute main line for white is the sensible queen c2, attacking c4 and eyeing black's kingside. We could spend an entire video discussing the ins and outs of this variation, but a popular line debated at Grandmaster level is a6. Black's idea is that if white plays queen takes c4, a respectable option within itself, then b5 is a way to gain active counterplay. Instead of capturing on c4 immediately, Grandmaster attention has shifted toward the prophylactic a4, grabbing space and discouraging black from playing b5. One interesting option for black is to play knight c6, adding more pressure against white's center. But another interesting choice is focusing on activating the light-squared bishop with bishop d7. When after white regains the pawn with queen takes c4, black is able to contest the long light-square diagonal with bishop c6. Black's light-squared bishop is found in active post, but white can still pose challenges to black with bishop f4 or bishop g5, moves that you can find in countless Grandmaster games. It's worth noting that white should develop the dark-squared bishop before playing the natural knight c3, preparing to help support a future e4. Since white's bishop is still on c1, the rooks are not connected on the first rank, so black can take over the initiative with b5, grabbing space on the queen side. After the queen moves, black will invade white's queen side with b4, gaining even more time by attacking the knight on c3. The point is, if white plays a takes b5, this actually loses material to a takes b5, attacking the queen and revealing the rook's attack against the rook on a1, so white is losing material as the position collapses. The closed Catalan with bishop e7 is a solid, reliable choice, but if black wants to immediately challenge white, seeking active play in the process, then black may prefer d takes c4. Turning the game into the open Catalan, black captures the c4 pawn, opening up the d-file, revealing the queen's pressure against white's center. The queen's pressure against the center may be supported by a future c5, knight c6, or even both moves combined. One potential drawback to this active approach is that it helps open up the long light-squared diagonal for white's light-squared bishop, and it also removes a pawn from the center, allowing white to often grab more space with e4. If white is worried about regaining the pawn immediately, it's possible to play queen a4 check, attacking the king and c4 pawn at the same time. This is not considered the most challenging line, as black should be able to equalize after knight b to d7, queen takes c4. The main idea is that black can play a6, preparing b5. Since a4 does not prevent black from playing b5, based upon the same sort of tactic we just explored, play typically continues with bishop g2, developing the bishop on the long diagonal, when after b5, queen c2, black is able to counter white's control of the long light-square diagonal with bishop b7. In some cases, black can even play bishop e4, gaining another tempo against the queen. In the open Catalan, if black is able to achieve a favorable c5 break without making any serious concessions, then white should not be able to claim any advantage, and may even encounter some problems. After white castles, black is able to achieve a comfortable position out of the opening with c5, striking in the center with an active position, when white's opening has not been a success. Instead of regaining the pawn immediately with queen a4 check, white's most popular option is to continue to focus on development with bishop g2. The Catalan is a flexible opening, with both sides having a wide variety of setups available. The plan of activating the light-squared bishop with bishop d7 and bishop c6 remains a valid option to keep in mind. Another idea is to play knight c6 immediately, increasing the pressure against white's center. When white can either play queen a4, pinning the knight on c6, and preparing to regain the pawn on c4. Another option for white is to simply castle. This encourages black to play rook b8, preparing a quick b5, potentially turning white's play into a gambit by holding on to the c4 pawn. In this sort of position, white will claim compensation by playing a quick e4, taking over the center with active chances. Another option for black to consider is a6, possibly preparing a future b5. But as we're learning the Catalan, it's important to examine two direct challenges against this opening. The first question to explore is what happens if black tries to hold on to the c4 pawn with b5. This daring move challenges white to prove compensation for the pawn. Thankfully, white has plenty of positive resources to respond to this ambitious choice, otherwise the Catalan would not be an opening consistently played at the highest levels of chess. A serious drawback to b5 is it weakens the h1 to a8 diagonal. The discovered attack knight e5 does not win material immediately, as black can close the diagonal for the time being with knight d5. Instead, a good idea for white is to first focus on weakening black's pawn chain on the light squares with a4. Black does not want to capture the a-pawn when black's queenside pawn structure is a complete mess, allowing white to regain the lost material with a strong position. Supporting the b5 pawn with a6 does not work, as white can simply play a takes b5, pinning the a6 pawn to black's rook. If black decides to play b4, then white can play knight e5, attacking the c4 pawn, as well as revealing the bishop's attack against black's rook on a8. White will be able to regain the c4 pawn with a comfortable position. Another way to reinforce the b5 pawn is with c6. Now that white has provoked another pawn move, it's an excellent time to increase the pressure with knight e5. Suddenly both white's knight on e5, as well as light-squared bishop attacks c6, so black sensibly tries to close the dangerous long light-squared diagonal with knight d5. Before continuing to actively pressure black's queenside structure, white takes a moment to castle the king to safety. It would be nice to develop the knight on b8, but it's currently protecting the c6 pawn, so a popular choice is to reinforce the c6 pawn with bishop b7. Now that the c6 pawn is protected, black can consider playing a move such as knight d7, challenging the active knight on e5. Former World Championship challenger, Grandmaster Boris Gelfand, shows us a positive way to challenge black's setup. He officially turns the position into a long-term gambit with b3. If black does nothing, white simply regains the material with a favorable position. So after c takes b3, before capturing the b3 pawn, Gelfand first plays a takes b5. C takes b5. Black's last capture has opened up the long diagonal, pinning the knight on d5 to the bishop on b7. White continued with queen takes b3, regaining one of the pawns and attacking the unprotected b5 pawn. His opponent defended the b5 pawn with a6. Black will remain up a pawn for the time being, but white has a strong lead in development as well as a safe king. Black's king, on the other hand, remains stuck in the center and needs at least 2 moves to castle. When you have a lead in development, especially to compensate for material, it's important to open up the position, and white did exactly that with e4. Taking space in the center, gaining a tempo against the knight, and most importantly preparing to open up the center after knight f6. Continuing with the dynamic pawn thrust d5. White is willing to sacrifice another pawn to open up the position, taking advantage of his active pieces and serious lead in development. Black's king will not survive long if black tries to hold on to the extra material, and Grandmaster Gelfand went on to win a nice game. If you face the early b5 variation as white, remember to actively develop your pieces, add pressure against black's queenside, and do not hesitate to open up the position before black has time to complete development and castle the king to safety. Trying to hold on to the c4 pawn with b5 is a playable option, but it's definitely risky. By playing d takes c4, revealing the queen's pressure against the d4 pawn, a logical follow-up is striking in the center with c5, adding more pressure against d4. In the open variation of the Catalan, it's not uncommon for white to gain a lead in development as black makes several pawn moves. This variation is no exception as white can simply castle. Black can certainly play c takes d4, when white can offer an exchange of queens with queen takes d4, or simply play knight takes d4, centralizing the knight and opening up the dangerous light-squared bishop, making it more difficult for black to comfortably complete development. Instead of releasing the tension, black's most popular choice is to add more pressure against the d4 pawn with knight c6. If you're interested in trying to seriously test black's position, in addition to the interesting knight e5, white's most active option is queen a4, pinning the knight and threatening knight e5. In response to queen a4, unpinning the knight with bishop d7 is black's main response, when you can explore white's most popular continuation with queen takes c4, as well as the interesting d takes c5. The tactical point behind queen a4 is that if black plays the sensible-looking c takes d4, white can play the surprising knight takes d4. Black needs to capture the knight with queen takes d4, when white responds with bishop takes c6 check. Since capturing the bishop loses the rook to queen takes c6 check, forking the king and rook, black is forced to play bishop d7. It appears black is heading toward a comfortable position, especially if white simply trades bishops with bishop takes d7, allowing black to create a solid game after queen takes d7. Instead, white can play the resourceful rook d1, attacking the enemy queen. If black captures the bishop with bishop takes c6, white can simplify the game with queen takes c6 check, b takes c6, and rook takes d4. White enjoys a pleasant endgame advantage thanks to black's weak queenside structure, doubled isolated c-pawns, as well as the isolated pawn on a7. Instead of capturing the bishop, black can sacrifice the queen with queen takes d1 check, queen takes d1, and bishop takes c6. By playing this variation, black is hoping to prove the position is solid enough to hold the draw, but white should be more than happy to play for a win from this position, safely playing for 2 results. If you're interested in continuing to explore this position, a good place to start is knight d2, adding pressure against the weakened c4 pawn. It isn't the first time we've mentioned the Catalan as a flexible opening, and instead of creating complications with the active queen a4, another option for white is to simplify the game with d takes c5. Offering a trade of queens, when after the exchanges queen takes d1, Rook takes d1, bishop takes c5. White can regain the c-pawn with knight b to d2. Since trying to protect the c-pawn with b5 allows the unpleasant knight e5, taking advantage of the pinned knight on the long diagonal, Black's best choice is to return the pawn and compromise White's queenside pawn structure with c3. White restores the material balance with b takes c3. In one high-level encounter, Grandmaster Wesley So castled the king, when his opponent, Grandmaster Anish Giri, played knight b3, gaining a tempo against the bishop. So after bishop e7, White played the instructive move c4, gaining control of the d5 square as well as opening up the long dark square diagonal, preparing bishop b2. White can then continue with knight f to d4, centralizing the knight, as well as opening up the light-squared bishop to create pressure down the long diagonal. It's important to keep in mind that Black is also not without ideas and can focus on completing development with bishop d7, followed by centralizing the rooks with rook f to d8 and rook a to c8, with a reasonable game. As we can see, the Catalan can both be used as an active positional weapon, as well as reaching a simplified position like this one, in which White has a slightly more comfortable position, intending to apply pressure and trying to positionally outplay the opponent, a valid strategy in these queenless middle games. As it turned out in the game, Grandmaster Giri was able to convert this position into victory against his esteemed opponent. The Catalan is a subtle, positionally rich opening, so it's no coincidence that it's attracted positionally minded, sublime strategic players such as former world champion Vladimir Kramnik. Against the Catalan, Black is certainly not without resources, including playing the solid closed variation, maintaining a pawn on d5, and trying to limit White's activity, or else immediately challenging White's setup with the direct d takes c4, turning the game into the open Catalan. If you're looking for an active, positionally complex game against the Queen's Gambit declined, then the Catalan may very well take center stage in your next game.